Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath, senior editor at Forbes. Hunter Biden, the son of President Joe Biden, faces 3 felony charges tied to the possession of a gun while using narcotics. He has pled not guilty, and his trial is underway. And yet, presidential historian Alexis Coe argues that Hunter Biden is not the first wayward first son. Alexis, what do we need to know about the precedent here?
There's no real precedent for this kind of relentless pursuit of a first son, but by no means is Hunter Biden the first son to humiliate his president father, and he probably won't be the last. But among the 250 years of history of families and their frankly ne'er-do-well sons, he's middling at best.
Middling at best. Now, you've written a lot about this. Someone who stands out to me is the son of Abe Lincoln, Robert Lincoln, who committed his own, or tried to commit his own mother to an insane asylum, which that in and of itself is insane because I don't think she herself was insane. What are some other examples over the course of history that stand out to you as particularly wayward first sons?
Well, from the very beginning, the founders' sons were really plagued by this generation of ne'er-do-wells. There was John Quincy Adams, and there was no one else really until Caroline Kennedy and then Beau Biden. But in the beginning, you had sons, for example, James Madison's son, who he raised from a very young age. It was technically his stepson, but it was his only son, him as a full son. He was in debtor's prison. He was also called upon for different various gun charges and dueling and rowdiness. This is someone who was in prison at the time that his father was president. You have this going on for generations. They're FDR's sons. They almost all traded some kind of attention for influence, for jobs, for anything to do with personal gains. What you have here, however, that differs is it got to the level of actual legal action. And we have seen that in recent history. We have Neil Bush, who is probably the lesser known of the Bush sons, and he stood before Congress 2 days of being grilled for losing close to $1 billion as the CEO of a company, but even he was allowed to settle out of court. So this is really unprecedented, and it's clearly not about Hunter Biden.
So there's the precedent of bad behavior, but you're effectively arguing that what's different here at this moment in 2024 is the politicization of the trial and of Hunter's behavior?
Yes, and it's so interesting because we are coming upon in 2026 America's 250th anniversary. And at the very beginning, when George Washington, the subject of my last book, left office, he was clear in his farewell address in 1796. He wrote that his biggest fear about political parties, he's the only president to have never claimed one, his biggest fear about them was that parties would not care about their constituents, they wouldn't care about voters, they wouldn't care about local interests, they would only care about accruing power. And that what that would do is, and this is a quote, sharpen the spirit of revenge. And what we see here is, I've been calling it an eye for an heir, because the Republican Party can't really go after Biden, or they've tried and they have failed to go after the president himself. And so they have gone after Hunter Biden, who's particularly vulnerable because of his past.
An eye for an heir. And I wanted to ask you if Trump's conviction almost distracts from Hunter Biden's trial. Does it make his issues more or less shocking at this moment in time?
I think that both parties are looking less than desirable to voters right now. They're very thin on legislation and very heavy on accusations, but these are clearly different trials. Hunter Biden, for the gun charge, I think even members of the Republican Party, Lindsey Graham, have said that this is not really a big deal. It's embarrassing for sure, but we have the president of the United States, a former president who's not the candidate again, who was recently convicted of many crimes, and one of the star witnesses was a porn star who he paid off, who was a great witness. And we're just not seeing that kind of cogent argument or powerful statements being made during the Biden trial. So I'm not sure that it will play well, but we're still it feels like we're close to November, but unfortunately we're not. It's just a very long election year. So it's unclear if it will sway voters, but it's just not as consequential.
Alexis, you wrote for CNN, quote, if Hunter Biden dominates the news in 2024 while Trump stands trial in multiple courtrooms, it won't be good for the Republican agenda. Why do you say that?
The Republican Party sells themselves on being tough on crime, being law and order. But it's hard to see that being clear right now in terms of their approach to both Biden and Trump. They are going after Hunter Biden for these far lesser charges. And he, again, is not a significant player in the grand scheme of 2024 and of the election. He never has been. And yet we have Trump, who they're making many excuses for, who has been convicted, our first president in 250 years who has been convicted of crimes. Now, what we see here is Trump responding to this by saying that he will go after, if he's reelected, he will go after Democrats. He will go after anyone who was involved in any of his court cases throughout the United States. And what we see from President Biden is a real commitment in more than just words, in action, to being a president of law and order, which is not something we associate with the Democrats. He is so committed to it that he has emboldened the justice system to go after his son. He certainly hasn't impeded it. That's not an argument that they can make. If they could, they would have.
He has not impeded it, but he has seemingly embraced his son, right? He hasn't distanced himself from Hunter. We have seen him in public with Hunter. We see First Lady Jill Biden in the courthouse. How does the reaction of the first family here compare to how other first families have handled their wayward sons?
Well, it's interesting. I'm a fellow at New America, which is a bipartisan think tank. And for the last year, I've been traveling the country on a sort of discussion tour. And I've been asking this very seemingly simple question: how should a president be? And one of the first responses I get across the board is empathy. And that is something that Joe Biden has always exhibited. This is not specific to Hunter Biden. He wells up on the campaign trail in a really authentic way that you don't normally see when presidents or aspiring presidents are eating ice cream and funnel cakes and shaking hands. He has always been known for his ability to connect with people. So it's not at all surprising that he is there for his son. He talks to almost all his grandchildren every single day, and he's got quite a lot. This is a large Catholic family. And so what we see, again, are these consistent behaviors from both presidential candidates, both a current and a former president, but both incumbents. And we see them really telling us and showing us who they are. And that's a really important thing for voters to look at. Being by your son's side and saying, I love him, as Biden did during the initial debate with Trump before he was elected. We saw Trump repeatedly attack Biden for Hunter, and this was before the charges. And Biden, I remember he touched his chest, but he said, my son, my son, my son. You see the incredible love that he has for all of his family. It's not surprising, but never has he said he's innocent. He hasn't made excuses, and he hasn't tried to cut a deal.
He has not tried to cut a deal. You mentioned the grandchildren, and I was going to ask you, we have seen Naomi Biden at certain state dinners, and he has embraced his grandchildren on the campaign trail and in the public eye. Is there any sort of strategy here of emphasizing some family members over Hunter Biden, excuse me?
I don't think there's any specific approach to this that the Biden administration is taking or guiding Joe Biden. I think that, people have favorite members of their families or members who live nearby. And so perhaps Naomi Biden is a resident of DC or of nearby Delaware, where they come from. You also saw President Trump install family members in his administration. And so it seems, again, compared to inviting a family member to a dinner party versus putting them in charge of the COVID pandemic to disastrous ends, that really speaks volumes about one's approach to family and governing.
Have you observed, as a presidential historian, the role of a supporting family in a presidency? Has it changed since the age of Washington?
Oh, absolutely. When George Washington was president, he had a special relationship with John Quincy Adams, as almost all the founders did. He was the best son, and he wanted to give him an appointment. And Quincy was so nervous about that. And he kept saying, I don't think I should have this benefit of knowing him because of you. And this was very hard for John Quincy Adams because he was the ultimate Washington fanboy. He essentially had a portrait of him in his room at The Hague when he was a teenager. So it was quite complimentary to him. Quincy said this again, you really do not see family members playing more than tangential roles, or roles, for example, with President Lincoln, with Abraham Lincoln. You see his son in the military, but you do not see them as a right-hand man. You don't see them playing a substantial or significant role until JFK, of course, the subject of my next book. He appointed his brother, Bobby, to be the Attorney General. And that is, again, a noticeable, really conspicuous appointment compared to an invitation to a state dinner.
We were talking a little earlier about an eye for an heir, and I'm wondering, does Trump's conviction muddy the waters in terms of how the public views Hunter Biden and this ongoing trial? Does it make it less clean or straight down the middle?
I'm not sure that it does. I look at the past and not the future, but it doesn't seem to me that it should. What we know about the Trump trial, about the recent conviction, because there are so many, but the most recent conviction, that was a group of Trump's peers in a state he has pledged allegiance to for quite some time, a place he did business in. They decided that he should be held accountable. They could have gone another way. This is, again, a jury of 12 peers. So Trump often says that everyone loves him, that everyone votes for him. This is an instance in which they did unanimously vote for him. And we have to look at that not as some sort of extension of the government or of a political scheme by the Democrats, because it's simply not. These are 12 individuals who, by the way, did so at great risk. We have seen a lot of the violence that has ensued at the behest of the Republican Party. We have seen what happens when people turn against Trump, and this is not a partisan perspective. This is simply what has happened in compared to other political parties. So I think it should be noted, and they should be viewed as patriots.
So I know you are a presidential historian. You look at the past, not the future, but based on what you have seen and studied of wayward presidential sons, how likely is it that Hunter Biden sees a conviction here?
Anything is possible. But again, why is it happening? It's a bad use of funds. It's a bad use of resources. And it's certainly a strange amount of attention to pay in such a consequential year to what would otherwise be a pretty insignificant court case. A Republican son, the most recent example, which we've already talked about, but it is relevant, is Neil Bush. That was settled out of court. So perhaps at the last minute, these things can always be settled out of court. That might happen. We don't know. But the fact that there has this been relentless pursuit of anyone that in the Biden family that they can get a hold of, whether it is an actual criminal case or just paying someone for someone's diary. I think that we need to look at our political system and what's within the bounds of propriety and what is certainly out of it. But what is comparable here? What is the agenda? We're talking about a president who has been convicted, who is sitting in many courtrooms throughout the United States, who is a presidential candidate for a major party, so the de facto leader of the Republican Party, and Hunter Biden, who has not held office, who is not seeking office. That's significant. It's not a fair fight. It's not equal, and it shouldn't be viewed as such.
It's not a fair fight. So I was going to conclude by asking you, what is your number one message for the public as everyone watches this trial unfold? You have studied the history. What is the one or two things people should have in mind as they watch the news cycle over the coming days and weeks?
Politics is not a reality television show. We will be living with the repercussions of whoever is elected for many decades to come. And we do remember in the recent past that we were very much affected by a presidential administration who mishandled a pandemic. We have to look not at the machinations of parties and of ads and political strategies, but rather legislation, which was very thin under former President Trump and has been substantial under Biden. He will go down in history as one of the most progressive presidents, despite to borrow a favorite phrase of former President Trump, the witch hunt that he has been the target of. And I think that is what voters need to look at, not these sideshows, but what really matters, because that is what is going to affect their lives on every single level.
Alexis Coe, presidential historian and author of You Never Forget Your First, a biography of George Washington. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your insights.
Thank you.